Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily podcast. Now, I have a great guest lined up for you today, all the way from New Jersey in the US. His name is Kris Beevers, and he founded NS1 to help companies like Dropbox and Salesforce navigate their traffic successfully across the internet and deliver an exemplary experience for their customers. But I want to learn more about the story behind the company and how he started off as a specialist in DNS, but has evolved to be a smart network control specialist, and of course everything in between. And he is also a recognised authority on all things DNS, but he also knows a lot about building and deploying high performance infrastructure at scale and on a global basis. So buckle up and hold on tight, because I'm going to beam your ears all the way to New Jersey, where we're going to discuss the impact of outages, including the recent heatwave and DDoS attacks, and discuss the importance of the open source community and how NS1 is working with them. So massive warm welcome to the show, Kris. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. And thank you, Neil, for having me. Really excited for the conversation. Now, my name's Kris Beevers. I'm the founder and CEO here at NS1. I'm an engineer. I've built internet infrastructure technology for a long, long time. And that's what NS1 is too. We are providing smart network control services that ultimately connect us all to the applications that we use all day, every day, by rethinking some of the foundational technologies of the internet and the network. We've been around for quite a while, about 10 years now or so. And you probably, without realizing it, interact with NS1 all day, every day, because we provide some of the core connective services like domain name services, for example, for some of the most important applications on the internet that we all use constantly, like streaming media services or news media services, enterprise applications that we all use at work, and so on. So it's a little bit about me, a little bit about us, and hopefully starts to paint the picture.
Fantastic. And you said that you've been in the tech industry for a long time now, but I'd love to take you way back in time for a moment. Can you remember where your passion for tech came from, or just a moment that would put you on this path you find yourself today?
Well, I think so. I have a facetious answer and then a deeper answer, right? And so the facetious answer is, of course, like almost everybody else, for me, it started with video games, right? Yeah. When I was a kid, and, I was fascinated with Doom and Wolfenstein, things like that, right? But of course, it wasn't as easy as downloading an app to your device, as it is these days, right? So in order to play these things, you really had to learn a little bit about the systems on which you were playing them, right? The computers themselves. And like everybody else, that was sort of the gateway drug for me. A slightly deeper answer for you. Internet infrastructure is a real passion for me. And that came a little bit later. When I was in university studying computer science, I took 1 year off during that first .com boom to start a startup with some colleagues, and we were building a technology in, at the time, the file sharing space. You may remember Napster, right? And so it wasn't Napster that we were building, but we were building a competitor there, and it got to some scale and had some success, and it was really exciting. But I found myself gravitating toward the problems of that scale, right? Like, how am I going to handle these millions of users who want to share all these music files and movies and whatever it is with each other? And I just found those problems absolutely fascinating and really fell in love with the challenges of infrastructure, and have been focused there more or less ever since.
Wow, what a great story. And of course, that path would eventually lead you to NS1. And can you tell me a little bit more about the story behind the company and its mission, of course, to help companies so widespread, really, from Dropbox to Salesforce, navigate their traffic successfully across the internet?
Yeah, I think it's here. I'll give you a little bit of personal context that feeds into why does NS1 exist, right? So I, prior to NS1, was leading technology development engineering at another internet infrastructure company that was called Voxel. And very few people have ever heard of Voxel. It wasn't a big company, but it was a pretty innovative one. And one of the things that we were building at Voxel was something that we would call a content delivery network. And the best way I can explain a content delivery network is anywhere in the world, you may want to connect to the internet and look at a cat picture, right? And probably when you want to look at that cat picture, you hope that it comes up fast, that you can consistently get the cat picture when you want to, and those other kind of characteristics of what we think of as a great experience interacting with, in that case, the cat picture, that piece of content. Content delivery network is technology built to make sure those things happen. And the way it works at the end of the day is very simple too. There are some immovable objects in the universe, and one of them is the laws of physics, right? The speed of light. And if the cat picture is sitting in a big data center on a hard drive or whatever in Northern Virginia, and you, Neil, are in the UK, or somebody else is in Singapore, which is where I happen to be living, as the idea for NS1 emerged, you're not going to have a great experience getting that cat picture, because one way or another, you're going to pay the penalty of the speed of light and sending your request all the way around the world and starting to get the bits of the cat picture back to you, right? So a CDN works by moving the content physically closer to audiences, right? By putting storage and data servers, right, close to end users all around the world, so that wherever you are, if you want to get a cat picture, you can be directed to a version of it that is near you and beat the speed of light, so to speak, right? So we were building that kind of infrastructure. And one of the most interesting problems in building content delivery networks is what we now have learned to call the traffic steering problem, right? I am Kris, and I'm in Singapore on Singtel, and I want to get this cat picture. Which of my content delivery networks servers all around the world should I go get it from to maximize that quality of experience? And we put a lot of time and effort into solving that traffic steering problem so that people could get their cat pictures faster and better from our CDN, and we learned a lot about how to do it well and so on. And at the same time that we were doing that in that business, we were also providing all kinds of other infrastructure services for companies like Dropbox and Salesforce and others who were, building other applications that needed to provide great user experiences to increasingly global audiences, right? People all over the world are starting to adopt these applications to do their work or, interact online, play games, watch movies, whatever it is. And I think the simple realization at the end of the day to derive it from all that was every one of these important internet companies is going to need to beat the speed of light, right? They're going to need to distribute their code and their data on servers or infrastructure all around the world. And then we're going to have to figure out how we get users to the right infrastructure to provide a great quality of service with respect to those applications. And that is where NS1 came from. So it's a little bit of a long-winded story, but it hopefully motivates for you that the basic problem we wanted to solve is making it possible for end users all over the world to have great experiences with respect to these applications that we've all come to use all day, every day. And, that's borne out, right? That's what has kept us in business and made us an engine for growth and, changing the way the internet works over the last decade or so.
And I love how you managed to bring the whole topic to life through the medium of cat pictures. That's a language everyone understands straight away, right?
It was the original motivation for the business, cat pictures. So there you go.
But as someone that knows a lot about building and deploying high-performance infrastructure at scale and on a global basis, I was excited to get you on the podcast today to try and get your insights on a few topics, because we are heading into winter now as we record this podcast. But of course, just a few months ago, we were all sweltering in a heat wave here in the UK. I suspect it was where you were too. And there were a lot of big tech outages throughout the world. So can you tell me a little bit more about the impact of those outages and also the importance of multi-cloud or multi-CDNs in that?
Yeah, and I think it's exciting and interesting that you're recognizing the relationship between the fact that it was really hot, and in fact it was really hot here in the eastern US a couple of months ago as well, and in the UK, and those outages, right? Why is that happening? Because all the things we do on the internet all day, well, they consume a lot of servers. And what do servers need? They need a lot of power. And what does power do? It generates heat when you're consuming it in these server form factors, right? So cooling these data centers is really hard when we have a world that is kind of I think we all recognize at this point, going down the the warming path, these problems are going to get more acute every single year. And we're going to see, the big, huge data centers and public cloud services and so on that ultimately underlie, our day-to-day on the internet, having more and more of these kinds of issues over time. So at the same time, something else that's changing is, our expectations of the applications that we use all day, every day are going up pretty fast, right? Like I have very little patience if I want to watch a movie on Netflix and it's down right now, right? Or maybe even less patience if I'm trying to get work done and I can't connect to Zoom and talk with you or use Google Docs or something like that, right? So, it is imperative for the people building and delivering these applications now to recognize that the kinds of outages that impact their services are going to continue to happen and increase in frequency and volume, and their users don't care, right? So they need to build their applications to be resilient to those sorts of conditions, and this leads us down the path of building infrastructure in distributed footprints, right? It's very simple. We don't want to put all our eggs in one data center basket or one cloud basket. This is what's led to the trend of multi-cloud, multi-CDN, and these other big themes. A lot of it is about resiliency, reliability, not just performance. And the end result is the same as we talked about with respect to cat pictures in Singapore, right? You have infrastructure that is distributed across multiple sites, potentially all over the world for purposes of resiliency, and you still have this question of which infrastructure am I going to send this user to right now to engage best with this application? You may now be optimizing for things beyond just performance. You might be optimizing to route around data center outages because of cooling failures and power shutdowns or something like that, right? And these are the kinds of things that happen all day, every day. But this is ultimately how the applications we all depend on work today to provide those great experiences, even though all this noise is happening. And we feel how important that is, to your point, Neil, every time one of these tech outages occurs, right? The organizations that haven't built their applications to be resilient to these outages fail and lose brand equity. They lose often straight up dollars, through your inability to, do e-commerce and buy things or pay them money for services or whatever it is. So it becomes imperative for them to make these kinds of investments.
And of course, as the leaves begin to fall off the trees and we start talking about pumpkin spice lattes, that also means we're going to be approaching Black Friday. And we are in a period of economic downturn at the moment, and this will be make or break for a lot of businesses and retailers out there. And yes, our inboxes are going to get bombarded with all those promotional emails, but in the past, we have seen big stores such as Macy's go offline on their busiest day due to DDoS attacks, of course. But can you just set the scene and tell the listeners a little bit more about what a DDoS attack is and also how businesses and retailers can better protect against them?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. We're coming up on Black Friday, and it's a big day, right? It's a really big day. And Cyber Monday, I suppose, is the new one, right? Especially for these online retailers, and retail is increasingly online, I think, as we all know. And we've just sort of talked about the impact to these companies of a failure on a day-to-day basis. Now, imagine that failure happens on a Black Friday or on a Cyber Monday, which is potentially their biggest shopping day of the year, right? It absolutely hits the bottom line very acutely, right? So, we need to certainly be investing in these sorts of situations to mitigate the impact of, heating and cooling failures and other sources of failure or outage in our e-commerce or our shopping apps or other things on Black Friday, which is when they're most likely to happen because there's such an intense set of activity. And that brings us to DDoS attacks. What is a DDoS attack? The distributed denial service. The purpose of a DDoS attack is to overwhelm an application or a service that is online with so much volume that it can't provide those services, right? So the end result of that is not very different from a power failure in the core data center of the application, right? You can't go buy something from that e-commerce site, right? If it's being DDoSed, off the face of the internet. So DDoS is a bad guy technique that's been around a long time on the internet, right? And attackers who use DDoSes are always getting more sophisticated and figuring out new ways to increase the volume of their attacks or target them more effectively and so on. And, this year, as almost every year prior, we're seeing bigger DDoS attacks, more frequent DDoS attacks. These things are used certainly against corporation and e-commerce sites and so on to damage them. They're also used by nation states in cyber warfare and everything else, right? So there are some very simple things that anybody putting an application online needs to be thinking about with respect to a DDoS attack. First and foremost, I think it comes back to what we've just talked about, with respect to increasing outages in general, which is don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? There's a few maybe subtle reasons why that's important. Certainly, obviously, you're easier to attack if a bad guy only has to knock one data center or one cloud provider or one piece of infrastructure offline to damage your services. So the more distributed you are, the smaller what we call the blast radius is of a failure like that. Another that's a little less obvious, I would say, is when you are singly homed, call it, in a data center, you're usually not alone, right? Usually you are purchasing infrastructure services from a provider who's providing those to others. And depending on how concentrated your footprint is, you're probably sitting there alongside others who may themselves be targets of attack. And so there are frequently cases where DDoS attacks result in collateral damage. Other companies who aren't actually the target go offline because they're proximal, right? They're in the same data center or on the same network as somebody who's the real target. It's another really important reason to distribute your infrastructure. And all this stuff starts to apply as well in our business, in the traffic steering business, right? We want our customers, for example, who are using NS1 for domain services, to have redundant networks providing those domain services. So if the target of the attack is your .com, whatever it is, we can protect that from those kinds of failures. And then, of course, there are companies out there who provide services to mitigate the impact of DDoS attacks and absorb all those volumes and so on. Really important, to the extent that your online application is important to your business, to protect it with those kinds of services too. So there's a lot of remedies for these kinds of attacks, but not everyone thinks ahead always. And when a day like Black Friday is coming, it's time to think ahead, right? If that's important to your business, you really need to protect against these kinds of things.
100% with you on that. And before you came on the podcast, I was doing a little bit of research on you. And one of the things that I came across was a topic very close to your heart, is the importance of open source and open source communities. So can you tell me a little bit more about that, and also how NS1 is working with the open source community too?
Yeah, I think we all, often without realizing it, depend upon open source technology all day, every day, right? I would venture to guess that a large portion of the pieces of technology in your home or that you interact with on a day-to-day basis are underpinned by open source technology of some kind. I first, really experienced the power of open source. I remember going to a bookstore when I was maybe a teenager and buying a book about Linux, and in the back of it was a CD, right, with a version of Linux on it. And I was able to put it in my computer and start to tinker in ways that I was never able to, not allowed to, on a closed source operating system, and fell in love with open source from that moment. The internet also is really underpinned by open source. There's so much software that we all depend upon all day, every day, without realizing it, that really runs the internet. And one of the things that we've always done at NS1 is sought to contribute back to that ecosystem and also invest in new open source technology. So, there's software that we use in our core services, built by foundations that we provide support to. Also, a big part of our business these days is built around open source technology. And I think to some people that might sound a little counterintuitive. How do you build a business, if you're giving the software away for free and in the open? But again, it turns out that a lot of the most important technology in our lives today, and a lot of the most important technology in business, is open source. Open source software is accessible. It's easy to begin to use, but as your use cases around it become more sophisticated and more challenging, you may want to engage with a company who is a specialist in some kinds of open source software. So to give you a couple examples, if you are a network operator, if you're running a network for your company, maybe a small network in branch offices or maybe a huge network, distributed all over the world, one of the things you need is the management system for that network. We call it the network source of truth, the big database of everything that is on the network and how it is connected and so on, so that you can keep track of all of that and manage it on a day-to-day basis. And at NS1, we have a business around the dominant open source product in that network management and automation space called NetBox. And that business exists because there's a huge universe around this open source project. There's a community of people who want to participate in it and who contribute back and so on. And then there are quite a few businesses who use this thing and want the backstop and the support and the engagement of a company like NS1, who's an expert in the technology and able to provide support or even host it, provide cloud services around it. So open source has been part of my end-to-end journey, and I'm really excited that it's part of our business journey at NS1 now too.
Love that. And I'm curious here, someone working right in the heart of this space, what are the kind of things that keep you up at night? And how do you also keep your curiosity and open-mindedness alive to unlock solutions to the kind of issues that you encounter?
You used a word that is really important to me. And in fact, one of our values at NS1 is curiosity, right? Yeah. We're a very curious culture. And some of that is me, right? I'm a tinkerer from the moment I put that Linux CDN or, had to figure out how to make some game work on my PC as a kid, the kind of wonder of tinkering with open source and computer technologies in general has driven my curiosity, right? So as the founder of the business, I don't think it's a surprise that that's a characteristic all in of our company and the people who have been attracted to work with me at NS1. We're a very curious organization. And as a result of that, we set dollars and time and resources aside for tinkering, right? For innovation, for exploring that curiosity and seeing if we can answer the questions of how can we make the internet better? How can we solve the problems that we see in our customers all day, every day? And that's the other piece of the puzzle that for me is really important to, maintaining this curiosity, maintaining this open-mindedness. I spend a lot of time with our customers understanding their problems on a day-to-day basis, right? The world is changing around us at a ridiculous pace. And, our customers are the people who ultimately keep it all working, right? That are, building these applications and the underlying infrastructure for these applications that make the internet work and make the internet interesting and important to modern life. And because of that pace of change, their lives are hard, right? They have to manage through all that change and adapt on a consistent basis and manage all the complexity of the infrastructure that makes the world tick. And there's no shortage of problems that those of us who are curious to invest in and tinker and solve those problems can access, just by understanding what's going on for, these innovators and these operators of today's infrastructure on a day-to-day basis. So for me, a lot of it is innate and a lot of it is about that engagement and listening to what's happening in the world around us.
And for our younger listeners that are just starting out their career in tech or business, what would you say the biggest lessons that you've learned in your career are?
There's, as you would imagine, there's a million lessons that we could draw on, but I'll pick one of my favorites, right? So, I'm a startup person. NS1 started as a few lines of code that I wrote on my couch and has blossomed over a decade into, really important business to the way the world works. But, I think I've always had that mentality of experimentation and iteration, for lack of a better way of putting it, right? And so what that means to me is there's a lot of value in trying an idea, throwing it out there into the world before it is fully formed and perfected and before you feel comfortable with it, and seeing how the world reacts, right? I think there's no better way to build something that people want, solve a problem that people have, than by sticking your neck out a little bit, right? By doing this experimentation, learning from the feedback that you get, iterating on the experiment and trying again until you find something that really sticks and really solves problems for people. And that, to me, that's the spirit of startups, and that's the spirit of technology. Is there are problems to be solved. We can apply technology to solve those problems. It's absolutely possible to spend way too much time in the lab, so to speak, or overthinking it. And so to me, the really practical lesson is put it out there, learn from what happens, and then try again based on that feedback. And that's really helped me, I believe, have an impact.
Wow, what a great story, and what a great career you've had here. But this is still just the beginning for you, of course. As we look to the future, what's next for NS1? What's your big focus right now?
Yeah, so we are driven, as we've talked about through this conversation, by wanting to have an impact on the way networks and the internet work, right? We really want to solve the problems of these innovators, these operators who are leaning into modern complexity of the network, solving for these increasing demands of audiences, solving for these challenges of DDoS attacks and outages and everything else. And so we're always investing in new technology to do those things in the foundational infrastructure of the internet and the network. Right now, a big focus of ours, we talked about open source a little bit, is in these areas of open source investment, because we see so much excitement in the networking community for open source network automation technology in particular. And we want to embrace that and help grow that engagement in the networking community. One of the biggest drivers of that focus for us is, we touched on it before, but I think it bears repeating. The connected infrastructure around us is increasingly complex. It's complex because we're managing for outages, and we're managing for security issues, and we're managing for an explosion of devices and connected systems, and everything is connected, and our whole world is interacting online these days. It's awfully hard to manage that complexity, and the number of people that we can throw at that problem of managing the complexity of the network isn't going up substantially, right? So that requires us to figure out, how do we automate the connected infrastructure around us? How do we get leverage so that we can do more online more effectively at a high rate of change, dynamic distributed infrastructure? And a lot of that is about unleashing the people who are running it through automation and intelligence. So those are our big areas of focus right now. And we're lucky to get to work with the best companies in the world to solve these problems for them.
Excellent. And if we started the podcast talking about your origin story, and we now found ourselves coming full circle, but I want you to ask you one more time to look back at your career, because I think none of us are able to achieve any degree of success without a little help along the way. So I'm curious, is there a particular person that you might be grateful towards, who helped you get where you are, maybe invested a little time in you, saw something in you that we can give a little thank you to?
Yeah, well, there are, just as we talked about there being a million lessons along the way, there are a million people that impact you along your career and enable you and empower you and coach you and give you feedback and all the other things that go into, helping anyone progress as a professional or in their career or in their lives. And there are so many of them that I'm grateful to that I can't name them all. However, there's one that might be a little counterintuitive, but I think rises above the rest for me. And NS1's a startup, right? So for those who haven't spent time in startups or built startups, they're intense, right? They're really intense, and a lot of ups and downs and a lot of challenges on a day-to-day basis in your life. And I'm about 10 years into this startup, and there's one person above all who has been the backstop for me, and that is, of course, my wife. Her name is Charlene, and she's not a startup person. She's not a technology person, right? These are not areas of professional expertise for her. But what she absolutely is, sort of the rock behind, my ability to, experiment and iterate and engage with my customers and do all these other things. She's the person who makes sure that I eat lunch every day, for example, right? So, it's maybe a bit different than what you might have been thinking, Neil, but probably the most important person for me professionally has been that person who's most important for me personally.
No, I think that's a brilliant answer. And I, for example, was on holiday last week. And even though I was on holiday, I was still on my laptop up answering emails and doing various little tasks to make it easier for when I come back. And my wife shared a picture saying, this is the side of things that you don't see. A lot of people can look on social media and be envious of the kind of life or the kind of work that you're doing, but they're the people that are by your side and live and breathe it alongside you, aren't they? And it's so important to recognise that.
Certainly. That's exactly right.
And obviously, before I let you go, for anyone listening that just like to find out more information about NS1, dive a little bit deeper in anything that we talked about today, what is the best starting point for all things NS1?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. Well, we're pretty easy. You can go to literally NS1.com and learn all about the company and what we do and so on. We're also all over social media, and you'll find us on Twitter at also NS1, or on LinkedIn. You can search for the company NS1. If you're curious about me, I mostly hang out on Twitter at BEEVEK is my Twitter handle. And so I'd love to interact with anyone who wants to. I'm always online, as you might expect.
Well, I think we covered so much in a short amount of time there, from the impact of outages, including the recent heatwave, DDoS attacks, kittens or cat pictures, and also the importance of open source, all washed down with your very personal and inspiring story. So just a big thank you from me, Kris, for sitting down and sharing that with me today.
Really appreciate it, Neil. Had a lot of fun talking through this with you.
What a great guy. I just love hearing more about what keeps him up at night as well, and how he keeps that curiosity and open-mindedness alive to find new solutions and innovate and overcome those challenges. But did anything resonate with you from today's conversation? And have you got anything you'd like to add? That's why I'm here. So please email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram at Neil C. Hughes. My website's techblogwriter.co.uk. Come and join the conversation. We'll keep it going. And I also cordially invite you to join me again tomorrow. So a big thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.